My name is Mallory. I am 34 years old, and this Christmas, I watched the woman I once called family turn into a monster in front of 20 witnesses. It happened in the middle of our formal dinner at the Beaufort estate in Charleston. My 6-year-old daughter, Phoebe, had spent 3 weeks carefully crafting a handmade family scrapbook for her grandmother, Gwendolyn. When Phoebe timidly handed it to her, Gwendolyn didn't even open it. She looked at my daughter with a coldness that made the room drop 10 degrees and said, "Children who don't carry the Beaufort features don't get to call me grandma, let alone clutter my home with paper scraps." Then, she dropped the gift directly into the fireplace kindling bin without breaking eye contact. The room went so silent I could hear the ice melting in the crystal glasses. My heart stopped, my vision blurred with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated rage. But before I could even find my voice to scream, someone else stood up. My 8-year-old son, Silas, pushed his chair back with a screech that echoed through the hall. He didn't cry. He didn't hide. He looked his grandmother dead in the eye and said something that shattered the Beaufort legacy forever. This is a story about what happens when you mistake a mother's silence for weakness and a child's loyalty for granted. Before I tell you how we dismantled their entitled world and left them with nothing but the dust of their precious heritage, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single second of how this reckoning unfolded. The humidity of a South Carolina evening usually felt like a warm embrace, but inside the Beaufort mansion, it felt like a noose tightening around my neck. The grand dining hall was a masterpiece of antebellum architecture, filled with the scent of expensive pine and the clinking of heirloom silver against fine china. Yet the atmosphere was poisoned by a tradition of exclusion that I had ignored for far too long. Gwendolyn sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a court of sycophants, her back perfectly straight and her eyes scanning the room for any flaw in our presentation. To her right sat my sister-in-law, Tabitha, who had spent the entire evening whispering into Gwendolyn's ear while shooting pointed glances at my children. Tabitha's daughter, a girl the same age as Phoebe, was currently wearing a velvet dress that probably cost more than my first car, sitting on a booster seat made of carved mahogany while my daughter was relegated to a small folding table near the kitchen door. This seating arrangement wasn't an accident or a lack of space. It was a calculated statement of hierarchy. For years, I had watched Gwendolyn orchestrate these subtle humiliations, always framing them as respecting the legacy or maintaining the dignity of the Beaufort name. My husband, Grant, sat across from me with his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack, but he remained silent, adhering to the unspoken rule that you never challenged the matriarch in her own house. The favoritism was thick enough to choke on. Earlier that afternoon, Gwendolyn had called Tabitha's daughter to the center of the foyer to present her with a gold locket containing a portrait of the family patriarch, claiming the girl had the true bone structure of a Beaufort woman. Phoebe had stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching the ceremony with wide, confused eyes, clutching the scrapbook she had spent weeks gluing together with glitter and love. I remember the exact moment the evening shifted from uncomfortable to unbearable. We were halfway through the second course when Tabitha laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound that carried across the room, and remarked on how fascinating it was that Phoebe looked so much like my side of the family. Gwendolyn put down her fork with a deliberate click, the sound echoing off the high ceilings, and leaned forward to inspect my daughter as if she were a curious specimen under a microscope. She noted that while Silas had the Beaufort brow and the dark, commanding eyes of his father, Phoebe was a complete stranger to their bloodline. She spoke as if my daughter weren't sitting 5 feet away, discussing her features with a clinical coldness that suggested Phoebe was a genetic mistake that needed to be managed rather than a grandchild to be cherished. The tension in the room thickened when the dessert was served, and Gwendolyn insisted that only those who contributed to the family's prestige should be allowed to sit at the main table for the final toast. It was a blatant move to isolate my daughter even further, forcing her to remain at her lonely little station while the rest of the adults sipped vintage port and celebrated their supposed superiority. I looked at Grant, pleading with my eyes for him to say something, anything, to stop this slow-motion car crash of a dinner. He reached under the table and squeezed my hand, a gesture meant to be comforting but felt more like a request for me to endure just a little bit longer. I realized then that my husband was still a prisoner of his upbringing, conditioned to believe that his mother's approval was the only currency that mattered in Charleston. As the evening progressed, the insults became less subtle and more frequent. Gwendolyn made a point of discussing the upcoming distribution of the family's summer estate in Hilton Head, openly stating that the property would be held in a trust for the legitimate heirs who reflected the family's values and appearance. The implication was as clear as the crystal chandelier above us. My daughter was being erased from the family tree in real time. Tabitha smirked, leaning over to pat Phoebe's head with a condescending pity that made my skin crawl, telling her not to worry because some people just aren't meant for the spotlight. I felt a roar of protectiveness building in my chest, a fire that was quickly consuming the last shreds of my patience. I wasn't just a guest in this house anymore. I was a witness to a crime against my child's spirit, and the Beaufort mansion was beginning to feel less like a home and more like a tomb for my family's happiness. The silence that followed Gwendolyn's comment about the summer estate was so heavy, it felt like the walls of the dining room were closing in on us. Phoebe sat perfectly still at her small table, her lip trembling as she looked down at the handmade scrapbook that Gwendolyn had pointedly ignored all evening. My daughter didn't understand the complex legalities of trust funds or the venom behind the word legitimate, but she understood the look of disgust on her grandmother's face. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Phoebe stood up and walked toward the head of the table, her small shoes clicking softly on the polished hardwood. She held the book out one last time, her voice a tiny whisper as she begged Gwendolyn to just look at the page she had decorated with pressed flowers from our garden. Gwendolyn didn't even reach for the book. She simply glanced at it with a flick of her wrist that sent the scrapbook skidding across the linen tablecloth until it hit a crystal gravy boat. "I believe I've made myself clear, Phoebe," Gwendolyn said, her voice dropping into a register of icy authority that silenced even the clinking of the silverware. "Paper scraps and glitter don't belong in a house of this stature, and neither do children who don't respect the lineage of the Beaufort name. You are a guest here by courtesy, not by right, and guests don't clutter my table with trash." She then looked directly at me, her eyes flashing with a predatory triumph, and added, "Perhaps if you spent less time encouraging her delusions and more time reflecting on why she looks so out of place in this family, we wouldn't have this unpleasantness." That was the moment the fire in my chest finally boiled over, but before I could utter a single word of the rage screaming in my head, a loud screech of wood against wood startled everyone. Silas, who had been sitting as still as a statue beside his father, pushed his heavy mahogany chair back with such force that it nearly tipped over. My 8-year-old son stood tall, his small hands balled into white-knuckled fists, and he didn't look at me or Grant. He stared directly at Gwendolyn, his dark eyes, the very eyes she praised for being true Beaufort eyes, filled with a cold, piercing clarity that seemed to strip away her polished facade. Without saying a word, Silas reached into the pocket of his dress slacks and pulled out the gold pocket watch Gwendolyn had gifted him only an hour earlier. It was an antique piece, worth thousands of dollars, engraved with the family crest, and intended to be his first step into manhood. He walked to the head of the table, his movements slow and deliberate, and placed the watch directly on top of Phoebe's discarded scrapbook. The heavy gold clattered against the paper, a sound of finality that made Tabitha gasp and drop her wine glass. "If my sister is trash, then your gifts are trash too," Silas said, his voice remarkably steady for a boy his age. The room went so quiet that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Silas didn't flinch as Gwendolyn's face turned a terrifying shade of crimson. He leaned in slightly, echoing the very posture she had used to intimidate his sister. "You keep talking about the Beaufort blood, Gwendolyn, but all I see is a mean old lady who is afraid of a little girl's book. If Phoebe doesn't belong at this table, then I don't belong in this house. And I definitely don't want a name that makes people act like you." Gwendolyn's hand flew to her throat, her chest heaving as she struggled to find air. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and fury. "I am your grandmother. I am the reason you have everything you see around you." She looked at Grant, her eyes wide and demanding. "Grant, control your son this instant. He is insulting his heritage. He is insulting me." Grant finally looked up. And for the first time in 10 years of marriage, I didn't see the hesitant, dutiful son in his eyes. I saw a man who had finally seen the rot at the center of his foundation. He looked at Silas, then at Phoebe's tear-streaked face, and then finally at the woman who had spent his entire life manipulating his sense of worth. Grant didn't yell. He didn't scold Silas. Instead, he stood up and reached over to pick up the gold watch, sliding it across the table back toward his mother. "The boy is right, Mother," Grant said, his voice low and vibrating with a newfound resolve. "You've spent so much time worrying about the features of your heirs that you forgot to check if they have a heart. If you can't see the value in my daughter, then you've lost the right to claim my son." He turned to me, and the silent plea for patience was gone, replaced by a sharp, urgent command. "Mallory, get the kids' coats. We're leaving, now." Tabitha began to shriek about how we were ruining the most important night of the year, but her voice felt like distant static. I grabbed Phoebe, pulling her small, shaking body against my hip, while Silas gripped my other hand like a soldier standing guard. We walked out of that dining hall, leaving Gwendolyn clutching her pearls and staring at the gold watch that had failed to buy my son's soul. The grand Beaufort mansion, with all its history and its supposed prestige, felt like nothing more than a hollow shell as the heavy front door slammed shut behind us, cutting off the sound of Gwendolyn's frantic demands. The heavy oak doors of the Beaufort estate had barely latched behind us before the freezing South Carolina rain began to mix with a bitter sleet, blurring the windshield of our SUV as we sped away. Inside the car, the silence was a living, breathing thing, heavy with the phantom echoes of Gwendolyn's insults. Phoebe was curled into a ball in her car seat, her face hidden against her stuffed rabbit, while Silas sat staring out the window with a stony expression that looked far too old for an 8-year-old boy. I was vibrating with a rage so intense that my hands shook against my knees, my breath hitching every time I thought about the image of that scrapbook sliding across the table. I didn't look at Grant as he navigated the dark, moss-draped streets of Charleston, but I could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. "I'm done, Grant," I finally whispered, my voice cracking like thin ice. "I am absolutely, fundamentally done. If you ever expect me or those children to step foot in that house again, or to speak to that woman, you might as well hand me the divorce papers now. I will not let her skin my daughter alive with her words while you sit there and respect the legacy." I turned to look at him, my eyes stinging with tears of fury. She called our daughter a genetic mistake. She threw her heart in the trash. "And you've let this happen for years because you were afraid to break the Beaufort silence. Well, the silence is broken now, and I'm the one swinging the hammer." Grant didn't respond immediately. He pulled the car over onto a gravel shoulder near the Ashley River, killed the engine, and slumped over the steering wheel. The only sound was the rhythmic drumming of sleet against the roof. When he finally looked up, his face was pale, his eyes hollowed out by a realization that seemed to have aged him a decade in a single hour. He didn't try to defend Gwendolyn. He didn't ask for patience. Instead, he reached into the center console, pulled out a leather-bound ledger he always kept for his legal work, and flipped to a bookmarked page near the back. He handed it to me, his fingers trembling. "You think I stayed quiet because I respected her, Mallory?" Grant's voice was a jagged rasp. "I stayed quiet because I was trying to buy her soul. I thought if I provided enough, if I kept the roof over her head and the taxes paid, she would eventually find enough peace to be a human being. Look at those numbers." I looked down at the page, and the figures blurred before my eyes until I forced myself to focus. It wasn't just a few bills. There were line items for the property taxes on the mansion, over $40,000 a year. There were maintenance costs for the historic garden, the salaries for the house staff Gwendolyn insisted on keeping, and the astronomical credit card payments for Tabitha's lifestyle expenses. "I've been funneling over $20,000 every single month into that house," Grant admitted, his head dropping back against the headrest. "My entire bonus from the firm, nearly 60% of my take-home pay, and the interest from the trust my grandfather left me, it all goes to Gwendolyn. She doesn't have a penny of her own, Mallory. The Beaufort fortune is a myth. It's a hollowed-out shell held together by my bank account and her delusions of grandeur. She spends every morning acting like a queen, while I spend every night figuring out how to cover the overdrafts she racks up at the country club. I stared at him, the rage in my chest momentarily replaced by a cold, numbing shock. $20,000 a month. That was more than some families made in a year, and my husband had been bleeding our future dry to subsidize the very woman who had just spat on our daughter's existence. "You've been paying for her to insult us?" I asked, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. "You've been working 80-hour weeks at the firm so she can sit in a mansion she doesn't own and tell our daughter she isn't good enough for the bloodline? Grant, that's not loyalty. That's an investment in our own misery." Grant turned to me, and for the first time, the shadow of the dutiful son was gone. "I know," he said, his voice gaining a terrifyingly calm edge. "I was raised to believe that the house was the family, that if the Beaufort name faded, I would have failed my ancestors. But tonight, when I saw Silas stand up, when I saw my 8-year-old son show more spine and more character than every adult in that dining room combined, I realized that the house isn't the family. The kids are the family. You are the family." He reached over, taking the ledger from my hands and slamming it shut with a sound that signaled the end of an era. "She told me tonight that Silas was the only true heir worth investing in," Grant continued, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "She thinks she has leverage because she thinks she's the one holding the keys to the kingdom. She has no idea that I'm the one who owns the lock. Starting tomorrow, the cash flow stops. No more property tax payments, no more staff salaries, no more paying for Tabitha's designer handbags. If Gwendolyn wants to live like a Beaufort, she can find a way to pay for it herself. We're taking that $20,000 a month and we're putting it into a relocation fund. We're leaving Charleston. Mallory, we're leaving it all behind." I watched him restart the engine, the determination in his eyes reflecting the cold, sharp light of the moon reflecting off the river. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew exactly who was going to win. The sun rose over Charleston the next morning with a cruel, mocking brightness, but inside our kitchen, the air was crisp and decisive. There were no tears this morning, only the rhythmic clicking of Grant's laptop keys as he sat at the breakfast bar with a pot of black coffee. I watched him from the doorway, seeing the man I had married, the sharp, calculated attorney, finally turn his skills toward protecting his own house instead of preserving his mother's illusions. He didn't wait for Gwendolyn to call and apologize, because we both knew that apology would never come. Instead, he started by logging into the Beaufort family's private trust portal, the digital gatekeeper to the lifestyle Gwendolyn took for granted. With a few deliberate keystrokes, Grant began deactivating every recurring payment associated with the Beaufort estate. I stood behind him as he checked off the boxes. The monthly landscaping fee of $2,000, the specialized cleaning crew that cost $1,500 a week, and the staggering property tax escrow that was due in exactly 10 days. Each click felt like a heavy stone being removed from our family's shoulders. "It's done, Mallory," he said, his voice devoid of any hesitation. "I've notified the bank that I am stepping down as the voluntary guarantor for the estate's line of credit. If she tries to swipe her black card at the club this afternoon, it's going to flash red." The first wave of the storm hit around 10 o'clock. My phone, which had been silenced on the counter, began to dance with incoming calls and frantic text messages. Gwendolyn didn't call me directly at first. She sent Tabitha as her scout. The messages from my sister-in-law started as confused inquiries about why the automatic payment for her SUV lease had bounced, but they quickly devolved into screeching accusations. Tabitha claimed that Phoebe's little tantrum had obviously clouded Grant's judgment and that we were being financially abusive to our own flesh and blood. I didn't reply. I simply blocked her number and handed the phone to Grant, who did the same without a word. By noon, the matriarch herself finally realized the magnitude of the situation. A private courier arrived at our door, delivering a handwritten note on Gwendolyn's heavy, cream-colored stationery. It wasn't a letter of regret. It was a summons. She demanded that Grant come to the mansion immediately to fix the clerical errors with the accounts and reminded him that his inheritance depended on his continued stewardship of the family name. The arrogance of the woman was staggering. She still believed she held the leash, even as the walls were literally crumbling around her. Grant didn't go to the mansion. Instead, he drafted a formal legal notice on his firm's letterhead and sent it back with the same courier. The notice stated, in cold, clinical language, that all voluntary financial support for the property at the Beaufort estate had ceased permanently. It informed Gwendolyn that she had 30 days to secure her own financing for the upcoming tax cycle, or the property would be flagged for public auction by the county. It was the digital equivalent of a nuclear strike. For 30 years, Gwendolyn had used the threat of disinheriting Grant as a weapon to keep him compliant, never realizing that the inheritance she was promising was already spent, and the only thing keeping the lights on was the very son she treated like a subordinate. An hour later, the calls started coming from Gwendolyn's personal cell. When Grant finally answered, he put it on speakerphone so I could hear. The voice on the other end wasn't the regal, controlled woman from the dinner table. It was a shrill, panicked stranger. "Grant, you cannot do this," Gwendolyn screamed, her voice cracking with a desperation she couldn't hide. "The country club gala is next week. The caterers are calling because their deposit was returned. Do you have any idea how this looks?" "People are talking, Grant. They are asking why the Beaufort accounts are frozen." "Let them talk, Gwendolyn," Grant replied, using her first name with a chilling neutrality that made her gasp. "You told my daughter she was trash in front of those same people. You told my son his sister didn't belong. If you're worried about how things look, I suggest you start selling the silver you're so proud of. Maybe that will cover the caterers." "You're being monstrous," she wailed. "Over a stupid scrapbook? Over a child's feelings? You would destroy 3 generations of history for that?" "No," Grant said, his hand tightening around his coffee mug. "I'm destroying a toxic lie to save the next generation. You have 30 days to find a new source of income, Gwendolyn. Don't call this number again unless it's to tell me you've signed the apology letter I'm sending over. Though even then, it won't change the bank balance." He hung up before she could respond, leaving the kitchen in a silence that was finally, for the first time in years, peaceful. The Beaufort legacy was bleeding out, and we were the ones who had finally stopped trying to perform surgery on a corpse. The following Tuesday, I was at my conservation studio, carefully removing layers of oxidized varnish from a 19th century landscape painting, when the front door chimes jangled with a violence that made my hand slip. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. The scent of expensive, cloying perfume preceded Tabitha Beaufort as she marched into my workspace, her face twisted in a mask of indignant fury. She wasn't just angry. She looked like a person whose entire reality had been shattered by a single bank notification. She slammed her designer handbag onto my workbench, narrowly missing a tray of delicate solvents, and began screaming before I could even set down my scalpel. "You manipulative, cold-hearted outsider!" Tabitha shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of the studio. "Do you have any idea what you've done? My mother is in bed with a migraine. The house staff have walked out because their paychecks didn't clear, and my own credit cards were declined at the salon this morning. You've poisoned Grant's mind, Mallory. You've turned him against his own blood over a few hurt feelings and a cheap scrapbook." I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my apron, and looked at her with a calm that seemed to unnerve her more than a shouting match would have. "Tabitha, you're trespassing," I said, my voice low and steady. "And as for the poison, I think you're confusing justice with a lack of subsidy. Grant and I are no longer interested in funding a lifestyle for people who treat our daughter like a second-class citizen. If you want to maintain your salon appointments, I suggest you find a job that pays for them." Tabitha laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "A job? Are you joking? I am a Beaufort. I have responsibilities to the community, to the legacy. You think you can just flip a switch and starve us out? That SUV I'm driving is registered to the family holdings. Mallory, you can't touch it." Grant might have cut the cash, but he can't take away our status. I felt a small, cold smile tug at the corners of my mouth. This was the moment I had been waiting for since the night of the dinner. Tabitha was right about one thing. The white luxury SUV she drove was indeed registered to a business entity, but she had forgotten one crucial detail. That business entity was Beaufort and Associates Preservation, a firm that Grant and I had co-founded 5 years ago to manage our professional assets and property holdings. As the majority shareholder and managing director, I was the one who signed the insurance premiums and the lease agreements. "Actually, Tabitha," I said, pulling a set of legal documents from my desk drawer that I had prepared only an hour earlier. "That vehicle is a corporate asset of my company. It was provided to you as a consultant for the estate, a position you've never actually fulfilled. According to the board resolution I signed this morning, with Grant's full approval as legal counsel, your consultancy has been terminated for cause. Specifically, for conduct unbecoming of a representative of this firm." Tabitha's face went from red to a ghostly, chalky white. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the repossession," I replied, pointing toward the large window that overlooked the street. Outside, a heavy-duty tow truck had already pulled up behind her gleaming white SUV. The driver was already attaching the hooks to the frame. "I've revoked the corporate insurance and reported the vehicle as no longer authorized for personal use. Since you refused to return the keys when I emailed you at 8 this morning, I decided to have it collected from wherever you happen to be. It just so happens you brought it right to me." Tabitha ran to the window, screaming at the tow truck driver. But it was too late. In the middle of downtown Charleston, in front of several of her socialite acquaintances who were walking to a nearby bistro, her symbol of status was being hoisted into the air. The humiliation was absolute. She turned back to me, her eyes brimming with tears of pure, selfish hatred. "You're destroying us," she whispered. "All of this, over a 6-year-old girl? No," I said, walking her toward the door and handing her her handbag. "All of this, because you forgot that the person paying for your life was the same person you chose to insult. You can call a taxi, Tabitha. Or better yet, you can walk. I hear the exercise is good for the soul, if you still have one." I closed the door and locked it, watching through the glass as she stood on the sidewalk, stranded and powerless, while the tow truck disappeared around the corner with the last of her borrowed prestige. 2 days after the incident with Tabitha's SUV, I received a phone call from a blocked number that I almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was raspy, elegant, and carried the heavy, rhythmic cadence of old Charleston royalty. It was Beatrice Beaufort, the elder sister of Grant's father, a woman who had been a ghost in our lives for over a decade. Gwendolyn had always told us that Beatrice was unstable and had been cast out of the family for shaming the bloodline. But as I sat across from her in a secluded tea room an hour later, I saw a woman who was sharper and more composed than Gwendolyn could ever hope to be. Beatrice didn't waste time with small talk. She placed a weathered manila envelope on the table and pushed it toward me with a trembling but determined hand. "Mallory, I've watched from the sidelines for far too long," Beatrice began, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me sit up straighter. "I heard about what happened at the Christmas dinner. I heard how that woman spoke to your daughter. Gwendolyn has spent 40 years acting like the gatekeeper of a temple that she doesn't even have the keys to. She calls your daughter an outsider. She talks about pure features and lineage." Beatrice let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "That envelope contains the truth she's been killing herself to hide. It's the reason she turned my brother against me and had me erased from the family tree." I opened the envelope, my breath catching as I pulled out a series of old legal documents and a yellowed birth certificate from a hospital in Savannah. As I scanned the dates and the names, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. The documents proved that Gwendolyn wasn't the high-born aristocrat she claimed to be. She had come from a family of modest means and had built her entire persona on a lie she had fabricated when she married into the Beauforts. More shockingly, the records showed that Gwendolyn herself had an older son from a previous relationship, one she had abandoned and legally erased to ensure her pristine entry into Charleston society. The very woman who had humiliated my daughter for not being pure Beaufort was a woman whose entire life was a performance of calculated deception. "But that's not why I called you here," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The Beaufort mansion and the land it sits on, they never belonged to Gwendolyn. They were held in a life estate through my father's will. My brother, Grant's father, was the primary beneficiary, but since his passing, the title was supposed to revert to the eldest living heir of the Beaufort name. Gwendolyn has been squatting there on a technicality, using Grant's money to hide the fact that she has no legal right to the property anymore." Beatrice reached into her purse and pulled out a notarized deed. "I am the eldest living heir, Mallory, and I've decided that I'm done with the Beaufort name. I'm signing the title of the estate over to a trust for your children, effective immediately." The weight of her words hit me like a physical blow. In one stroke, the power dynamic had shifted completely. Gwendolyn wasn't just broke. She was an illegal occupant in a house that now belonged to the very children she had insulted. Beatrice looked at me with a sad, knowing smile. "Don't thank me. This isn't a gift. It's an eviction notice for a ghost. Gwendolyn needs to face the world without the mask of a mansion to hide behind. She needs to know that the legacy she used as a weapon has finally turned its blade toward her." I spent the rest of the afternoon at Grant's office, watching as his legal team verified every document Beatrice had provided. Grant sat in his leather chair, staring at the birth certificate of the half-brother he never knew existed. His face a mask of cold, silent realization. The woman who had demanded perfection from everyone around her was the most flawed person in the room. He didn't say a word as he signed the final acceptance papers for the trust. He simply looked at me and said, "The 30 days are up, Mallory. It's time to tell Gwendolyn who truly owns the Beaufort name." We weren't just cutting her off anymore, we were taking back the ground she stood on, ensuring that she would never again have the platform to hurt our children. The house of cards was falling, and the wind was just beginning to blow. 6 months have passed since we left the heavy humidity of South Carolina for the crisp, clean air of Seattle, and the silence from Charleston has been the greatest gift we ever gave ourselves. We didn't just move to a new city. We moved to a new life, where the name Beaufort carries no weight, and the only legacy that matters is the kindness we show one another. Grant took a senior position at a prestigious environmental law firm here, and with the $20,000 a month we are no longer pouring into a sinking mansion, we've built a college fund that will ensure Phoebe and Silas never have to beg a relative for their future. The news from Charleston reaches us occasionally through Beatrice, though we've made it clear we want no direct contact. The downfall was as swift as it was earned. Without Grant's financial life support, Gwendolyn was forced to face the reality of the debts she had spent decades accumulating. The historic Beaufort mansion, the pride of her hollow existence, was foreclosed upon and sold at a public auction 2 months ago. It is currently being renovated into a boutique bed and breakfast by an out-of-state investment group, a final irony that would surely make Gwendolyn's blood boil. She and Tabitha are now living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a part of town they used to scoff at, and for the first time in their lives, they both have retail jobs to cover their own electricity bills. Tabitha's social circle evaporated the moment the luxury SUV was towed, and the invitations to exclusive galas stopped arriving. It turns out that when you build a life on the slandering of others and the spending of money that isn't yours, you find yourself very lonely when the well runs dry. There was no grand reconciliation, no tearful apologies, and no second chances. We didn't need them. We chose to protect our children over protecting a facade, and in doing so, we found a peace that no amount of antique silver or pure bloodlines could ever buy. Phoebe is thriving in her new school, her scrapbook now filled with photos of mountain hikes and new friends who love her for exactly who she is. Silas still has his Beaufort eyes, but now they shine with the pride of a boy who knows that true strength isn't found in a last name, but in the courage to stand up for what is right. We learned that blood might make you related, but loyalty, respect, and unconditional love are what make you a family. Gwendolyn wanted a legacy of perfection, but she ended up with a legacy of ashes. As for us, we're finally home.